Today I would like to talk about the absence of the ego in the Confucian Way. This is one of the most significant differences between East and West in this context, between the Confucian tradition and the development of Western philosophy. And this difference led to a critique of the Confucian tradition, which is now old, by Max Weber, a German scholar who wrote the book Religion of China. And the book was first published in German edition in the year 1915. Max Weber, W-E-B-E-R, was the author of a book on Protestantism and the rise of capitalism. So in this critique, which is old by now but very instructive, and a critique which has dictated, as it were, the battle lines ever since, Weber stresses the internal strength and potency of the individual will. And anybody brought up in the West will recognize this emphasis on individuality, personal responsibility and personal willpower, all wrapped up in the desire for self-realisation. So I call this the Miss Piggy school of thought. It's all about moi. What can I do? What I want, what I need is preeminent. Now this is a gross caricature, I hasten to add, but you get this. The idea of the individual self was slow in coming in the West. In classical antiquity, there was no idea of the ego or the self, and the word for person, which was prosopon in ancient Greek, meant both person and mask. Masks were frequently used in the theatre, in the Greek plays, to designate characters. It was the same in Latin. Persona means both person and mask. And this survives in the French expression ma personne, by which we mean my persona, as perceived from the outside by others, externally, my way of presenting myself to the external world. In short, my exterior person. But there was still to come the idea of the internal subjective self, the internal subjective person or ego. And this came with the Neoplatonist philosopher Plotinus, and then in Christianized form with St. Augustine, who wrote the first autobiography in Western literature, entitled The Confessions. This autobiography was about himself, of course, and there was no real precedent for this literary genre. The invention of a literary genre then came along with the invention of the self in philosophy and the philosophy of psychology. Then we know, of course, that the Renaissance and the Reformation accelerated this idea of the individual self and the personal pathway towards self-fulfillment. And Freud, the psychoanalyst, took it in different directions, though never abandoning the idea of the individual and his or her subjective life, which was unique and alone. So Max Weber, brought up by a Calvinist Christian mother and much influenced by her, saw a gap in traditional Chinese philosophy. He said that Confucian ethics lacks any tension between nature and deity, or between human fallibility and ethical obligations, any consciousness of sin or need for salvation, and so on. He also said, "We know of no scientifically ascertainable ideals. To be sure, that makes our efforts more arduous than in the past, since we are expected to create our ideals from within our breast in the very age of subjectivist culture. So, speaking as a Westerner, he says we are expected to create our own ideals from within ourselves. And I well remember the slogans painted on the walls in the Paris Revolution of 1968, I was there then, now referred to by the French as the events of 1968. Nobody quite knows whether to call it a revolution or not. And the students sprayed the words on the walls, "Take your desires for reality." If it's your desire and you want it, then it's good, and you should pursue it. Above all, it must be yours and yours only. How different this is from the Confucian tradition, and the importance of the sociologist Max Weber is that he so clearly shows the difference. It is he who shines a light on just where the difference lies, and this is why it's valuable to think about him in understanding the Confucian pathway. When one thinks about the qualities of the humane individual, qualities such as deference, tolerance, making good on one's word, diligence, and generosity, these do not sound like the qualities of someone who is taking his own desires to be reality, as the Parisian students wanted. These qualities involve restraint, self-discipline, and self-cultivation. This last one is very important, self-cultivation. That is the ability to develop oneself by training, practice, and discipline, which is extremely important in the Confucian tradition. To take an example, the ability to be deferential is not something which comes about by accident. For example, deference requires an alertness to others, a deliberate, practiced sensing of their position and their needs and requirements, and the ability to manage one's own language, and indeed body language, with self-awareness. Remember the body language exhibited by Confucius in the way he handled the tablet. Diligence is something similar. It requires self-awareness and discipline. So the emphasis on ritual in the Confucian pathway is something which I've mentioned before and which we miss in the West. The ritual involving funeral ceremonies is an example, which is frequently covered in the Confucian texts, and also concerning the giving of gifts. Now, gift giving is such an important subject that I will cover it separately, but ritual in general is an important part of the Confucian way. There has been some discussion of the term self-cultivation, as Tu Wei Ming mentioned this and emphasized it, rather, in his exposition of the moral philosophy of Confucius. But he felt compelled to explain that by this he did not mean that self-cultivation arose out of some moral core which took a private and personal decision, and then commanded the self to cultivate itself. The self-cultivation which occurs in the absence of such an ego or command center, but rather a response to other people, and is generated by the presence of the other. There is no command center making decisions which then become actions. But it's the community which produces the response. Take, for example, Analects 9:3. The master said, "The hemp hat is that which is prescribed by the rules of ceremony, but now a silk one is worn. It is economical, and I follow the common practice. Bowing before entering the hallway is prescribed by the rules of ceremony, but now the practice is to bow only after ascending it. That is arrogant. I continue to bow below the hall, so I oppose the common practice." This passage shows us a couple of things. One being that the rules or the practice of rituals could change. Hemp cloth was clearly more expensive and less available than silk. An interesting bit of economic history there. But convenience and cost, by common consent, could lead to a change of ritual. The next important issue is that a certain behavior is deemed to be arrogant, and this is incompatible with the Confucian requirement of modesty and deference in general. Arrogance and the impression of arrogance must be worked on, and arrogant behavior must be changed. Notice that the emphasis is on behavior and not on the internal state of mind. This is practical ethics, in that people do not respond to your state of mind or your internal ego, they respond to your behavior and the external presentation you exhibit. The last point is that Confucius is the sage who can say what is arrogant and what is not. He sees himself that way, as the one who can make ethical assertions and have them accepted. Furthermore, others see him that way, as the chosen one, if you like, the one whose views will be accepted and followed. Isn't it interesting that a chosen one like that can crop up? Lastly, returning to Max Weber, late in his career he introduced the wonderful idea of the re-enchantment of the world. He spoke about disenchantment, which he saw as coming about through the development of capitalism and the rational economic and administrative organization of people and resources. He thought this was now removed from its early religious roots, and that progressive rationalization led to human beings becoming simply cogs in a machine, which left them adrift in a sea of modernity, without gods or moral poles, without moral direction. This leaves us with the question of how the world may become enchanted again for us, how we may retrieve its magic, allowing us to feel its seductive and attractive power. I often think about this, and I live in a particularly beautiful part of the world, where it is easy to be enchanted by nature, though not so easy to be enchanted by the world of humanity. The Confucian emphasis on ritual may offer the re-enchantment which Max Weber thinks is needed, in that the first thing it does is bind you to your community and provide a social glue. Ritual is not alien to the human race. It is natural to it, and Confucius' laying down of rules about it is not alien or unwanted. Any Confucius could arise in any culture, and recall us to rituals which bind us together as a community, or even invent them, provided that person has the moral authority to act as what I called the chosen one, chosen by the people who recognize that authority. So Confucian ritual may provide for the re-enchantment of the social world, but I should say that probably Max Weber would not have agreed with this. So thank you for joining me, and in the next session I will be discussing learning from nature and the Confucian interest in water and the way water works. Thank you.